Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Food Safety Educational Conference as part of this year's virtual Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. I'm Jill Dunlop, and I'm with the USDA, their marketing, and I'm going to be the moderator for this presentation. So first, I'd like to thank Highland Ag Solutions for sponsoring this year's Food Safety Educational Conference. So now let's watch a short video by Highland Ag Solutions.
Highland is virtualizing the business of agriculture. From soil to sale, we are uniting growers, packers, marketers, and their customers in ways never done before. In today's global marketplace, competition has never been fiercer. You need innovative tools to provide business and market transparency for the industry to remain sustainable for future generations.
Okay, so next I'd like to go over that pesticide CEUs are available for most presentations offered. And you will need to you will have to register each time for the CEUs for each presentation. So there is a pesticide CEU guide for a list of the approved presentations and the participating states. This guide is located in the Events Resource tab under the Media Player. The guide is also available at the Resources Center located on the main page of the conference. Please note that these CEU credits are only for registered attendees and during the live presentation. They will not be available for on-demand viewing. So for the CEU process, go ahead at the end, sign into the audience chat box your first and last name and the states for which you're requesting the CEUs. You'll want to sign out also in the audience chat box, first and last name with the states. And you will need to do this for each presentation that you are requesting these. Now, the third step is to complete the CEU registration form, which you can find under the Event Resources tab. This you will only have to complete once. So for this presentation, we are live, and you can go ahead and type in your questions, and we will get to them at the end of this presentation in the questions box below. Make sure you press send. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for making this educational part of the show. So please make sure you visit the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. Lastly, don't forget that we have morning coffee chats and evening receptions and networking beginning at 5. Okay, so next I would like to welcome Kristen Woods, who is going to present for us today on co-managing food safety and conservation. So Kristen is with the Auburn Extension. And Kristen, hi.
Great. Thank you, Jill. And I also, of course, want to thank the Southeastern Fruit and Vegetable Conference for the opportunity to talk today. I am an extension educator with a background in food safety. I've been doing food safety extension for about 17 years, all different kinds, with an emphasis on fruits and vegetables about the last 7 or 8 years. So today I'm going to get to talk about a little bit of that, plus a little bit of a personal interest of mine. I have a small farm in West Alabama, and my farm is part of USDA's Conservation Stewardship Program. And I'm also an avid wildlife enthusiast and birder. So getting to talk about that intersection between wildlife and conservation and the effect of of the landscape on produce safety is kind of a treat for me. This presentation is going to be a little bit different than some of the others that I've seen in the last few days. I am not presenting my own research, but rather I am going to highlight about 6 different studies of other people's research and see what we can glean from that around conservation and food safety with an emphasis on birds. So first of all, I want to just give everyone a reminder about why are we talking about produce safety in fruits and vegetables to begin with. So just really quickly, have in the back of your mind that it is really a big issue because fruits and vegetables are being eaten without cooking. Many times you'll see people eating blueberries and grapes and such in the grocery store. They're not even taking them home and washing them, right? So they need to be getting to the consumer in really good quality, really good microbial safety. Low numbers of pathogens can be infectious. We're talking about just 1, 2, 3 bacteria that can make somebody sick. And of course, we can't see them. So transient contamination on the farm also makes things really challenging for growing produce and knowing if it's been contaminated or not. So think about wild hogs or deer that travel through a field. You might not even have seen those animals go through that field, and that contamination might be there for a few days, and then environmental conditions would allow it to degrade. So, once attached, pathogens can't be washed off of most fruits in most processes anyway. So if you think about the surface of a blueberry, scrubbing that surface is not a feasible thing to do, right? We destroy the product doing that. And then lastly, I want to point out that we have an increasing number of immunocompromised consumers that are eating fruits and vegetables, and they're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables because those things are healthy for them. And our food has to be extra safe for all of these folks, right? All right. So when we talk about food safety and we start talking about the environment and conservation, there are a lot of things going on in the background. First of all, we have the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule that was signed into law in 2011 and went into effect in 2016. Of course, that's the first regulation that directly affects produce farms. We've got the LGMA water quality standards, as well as a lot of other buyer requirements that seem to discourage some of the conservation practices that going on. We have the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and especially their CSP program. NRCS has been around for about 80 years, promoting conservation practices on private lands. And while NRCS does give technical assistance around conservation strategies that might prevent pathogen movement on a farm, their advice is not meant to be taken as food safety advice. It's conservation oriented. And then we've got the USDA National Organic Program that's been around for about 20 years, providing standards to improve ecological sustainability on farms and providing a marketing premium for growers that participate in that program. And we've got the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which prevents the destruction of endangered species or their habitat. But a lot of people don't know that it also mandates these other federal agencies from consulting NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that the legislation that they enact also does not destroy wildlife or their habitat, endangered wildlife or their habitat. All right, so if that's at the national level, and I probably even missed some things, but if we start looking at the state level and even the local level, it becomes an incredibly complex landscape to try to navigate. Oh, last we've got the Environmental Protection Agency, of course. They're regulating pesticides, including the ones that are used on packing houses and farms for cleaning and sanitizing, and then sometimes to treat irrigation water as well. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to highlight a couple of the high-profile outbreaks from out west. What you're looking at in this slide is an aerial view of the growing area that was responsible for the spring 2018 E. coli 0157H7 outbreak. It's the Huma growing region. What you're looking at in the brown areas there is a cattle feedlot, and the green area is the growing area surrounding a feedlot, and an irrigation water canal running through the middle there. The yellow pins are where they found positive samples that were positive for pathogenic E. coli. Only one of those samples, it was in the irrigation water canal, was positive for the outbreak strain of E. coli. So when I saw these results, I thought, wow, they're growing lettuce surrounding a feedlot. Well, it makes sense that they could get contamination, but we're not doing that in the Southeast, not in Alabama or Georgia. So we're probably okay. I don't have to worry about that too much. Well, then they published the report on the fall 2009 E. coli 015787 outbreak. This is from the Salinas Valley growing region. It was actually 3 separate outbreaks. There were different strains of E. coli, but still caused quite a few illnesses from a common grower in that area. And they did, again, took quite a few samples, and they found one of the outbreak strains on a cattle gate that was less than 2 miles from the growing area. When you look at that, and you look at the area that was implicated in that outbreak, we don't see cattle feedlots. We see cow-calf raising operations, right? And we have those in the Southeast. In fact, we have a lot of those, especially in my area in Alabama. We've got little herds of cattle everywhere. And we have small growing operations, and they're in very close proximity to one another. When we dig into this report a little bit more, we don't really know how the E. coli made it to the growing area. It could be wind, it could be water, got into the irrigation water canal again, and it could be wildlife, going through that area. But when I saw this, it made me much more concerned about the environment that we have surrounding our growing areas and the effect that can have on produce safety. And it caused me to dig into the research around this a little bit more. All right, so today I'm going to talk about wildlife and habitat surrounding growing areas. In particular, I'm going to talk mostly about birds, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage with looking at wildlife and the relative risk there. So if we look at this as a risk continuum, low risk on the left, higher risk on the right, we've got things like caterpillars. In that case, it's a swallowtail caterpillar feeding on some dill. And that's a pretty low risk animal. Even if that caterpillar did crawl through some feces and become contaminated, it's not traveling very far in its lifetime. It's not going to spread that contamination. And then we got things like flying insects, pollinators that are doing some wonderful things in our environment. We absolutely need them. And then we have other flying insects like flies that could potentially have access to a sewage source or a manure source and then bring that back into a growing area. And then we've got things like our warm-blooded animals and our wildlife, wild hogs, deer, things like that, that have the ability to travel long distances. They can both track contamination from one area to another on their feet, on their bodies, but they can also carry pathogens in their intestines. And so as they defecate along their travels, they can spread contamination that way. And then the last photo there I wasn't quite sure where to put that exactly, but in an urban setting in particular, we might have very close proximity between human garbage and human sewage in urban growing areas. So an example of a rat being able to access human garbage and then take that into a growing area would be a pretty high risk situation. All right, and then we've got birds that kind of fall all over the place, depending on the bird and depending on the situation. So, but in general, we can look at insectivorous species of birds and raptors as being more low risk, and flocks of some types of birds, I'll say our non-native species in particular, could be higher risk. All right, so in setting the stage just a little bit more, I want us to try to think about a world where we can envision birds as being part of an IPM strategy. So kind of like organic growers would use insects like ladybugs in an IPM strategy. And, when we look into the literature, which we're going to go into some of it today, does the literature provide enough information on food safety risk to actually implement an IPM strategy that includes birds? I don't know, maybe not yet. And do we know enough about ecosystem interactions to implement an IPM strategy? This is a really complex landscape to be looking at. And as I was listening to some of the talks earlier this morning and this afternoon, a couple of things caught my attention. Michael Menjak was talking about the economic impact of bird damage in fruit crops in particular. And he cited 4 small fruit crops in 5 states, and the economic impact of bird damage from that being $189 million. So he talked a lot about mitigation strategies for that. Obviously something that we need to address, but there's not a good mitigation strategy. We can use noise deterrents and streamers, and all of those things are really labor intensive because the animals get used to them very quickly and they have really limited effect in the first place. Netting is pretty effective, but incredibly expensive. And it also has the effect of preventing the birds from providing their ecosystem services to that crop. So you might have to spray more for the insects that those birds aren't eating, which then we can draw from that we might be negatively affecting our pollinator populations that way. So when we think about using our ecosystem and increasing biodiversity in the ecosystem to take advantage of what's going on in nature, that might be an option. All right, so just to start off, this is the first study that I wanted to highlight. It's from Matthew Jones, doing this research out on the West Coast. And has nothing to do with birds, but it does have to do with ecosystem interactions, and it's pretty interesting. They looked at the effect of Cathophagous insects on fecal processing in pasture situations. So what they found was that when dung beetles were present in these pastures, there was improved processing of fecal matter, so that fecal matter degraded more quickly, which is good news because that's these bugs' one job in the ecosystem is to do that. So they're very effective at doing that. When they looked at organic systems, including these dung beetle populations, that they showed greater fecal processing compared to conventional systems where they introduced a single species of beetle. They also found that some dung beetle species are better at reducing E. coli 0157H7 than others. So what they hypothesized that there are combined effects of a biodiverse soil microbial population and a biodiverse insect population that's supported by an organic system that really made the difference in the processing of fecal matter, and in particular the processing of E. coli 0157H7 in that environment. And just before this, I was listening to a talk by Jason Smith, who was talking about the need for biodiversity in the environment and supporting pollinators. And he also talked about supporting parasitoids in a biodiverse environment, which was something that was totally not on my radar. But those parasitoids would feed on predatory insects in a growing operation. So, in general, supporting that biodiverse ecosystem has all kinds of beneficial effects. All right, so this next study that I wanted to highlight is from Daniel Karp. His research was also done out west a few years ago, and they looked at the effect of surrounding land use on the presence of pathogenic E. coli in lettuce fields. When you look at that chart on the right, on the top, we're looking at the effect of land use on generic E. coli in water. And the bottom, we're looking at effective land use, surrounding land use on or hemorrhagic E. coli in leafy greens. The yellow bar there is growing areas surrounded by cropland. The brown bar is growing areas surrounded by grazable land. That dark green bar is growing areas surrounded by riparian areas, and the light green is growing areas surrounded by other natural areas. So when you look at the top, you can see that they found no significant differences on generic E. coli in water. There's a lot of variation, again, in the riparian zones and other natural areas. But it can be very difficult to find differences in water, especially if some of their water sources were moving water sources like rivers and creeks. What I find more interesting from this data set is that they found in the growing areas surrounded by grazing resulted in higher levels of enterohemorrhagic E. coli than cropland, riparian zones, or other natural areas. So what we're looking here is this little brown bar that's higher than all the other bars. So it's really interesting to me, and also lends some information to FDA's reports on the cattle. The two outbreaks I highlighted that were surrounded by cattle raising areas. So potentially a higher level of risk when growing areas are in proximity to animal raising areas. What I wanted to also bring to your attention is the high level of variation in the riparian zones and the other natural areas. Although it looks like these might be lower levels of E. coli, there's a ton of variation in those samples, and we really don't know all of the contributing factors, and we need more research to figure out what's contributing to higher or lower risk in that. Right. So this next study was conducted by Elisa Olimpi. Also, this was research from out west, and they looked at habitat. They looked at I skipped a slide, and that's why I messed up. Hang on just a second. Okay. So Olympia looked at the effect of surrounding habitat on strawberry damage out in California again, and they estimated that by removing habitat around growing areas, this reduced bird diversity and could increase costs from bird damage by up to 76%. Jill, I'm not moving my slides, but they're moving.
I apologize, that's me. Did it go back to where you were?
I don't know. What I want to be talking about is this one, actually, because this leads to the next one. All right. So
okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. So this study was where David Gonthier looked at habitat around strawberry growing operations in California landscapes. And I think they looked at about 20 different farms. And first they did some exclusion studies that were pretty interesting, where they used nets to exclude birds from the areas. And what they found was when they excluded the birds from a strawberry area, that they actually had more insect damage. So the birds were both sometimes, right, damaging and eating the fruit, but some of the birds or other species of birds were also eating insects that were eating the fruit. So they actually found a net zero effect of the birds in those landscapes. It's just interesting. When they looked at what was going on around the strawberry farms that they were investigating, and they saw an increase in semi-natural land coverings surrounding these growing areas, they saw an increase in bird species diversity that was encouraged by that natural landscape surrounding the growing areas. And in particular, specifically, they saw an increase in insectivorous species. So there's a shift in the species of the birds it's encouraging more of those insect-eating birds. And so you have fewer of those fruit-eating birds in that bird population. So they saw less bird damage to strawberries overall when they have there's an abundance of semi-natural land covering. All right, let me go back to Olympia real quick because this is interesting. They found very similar results in this study, also done in California. They took it a step further, though, and they estimated that Removing habitat around growing areas reduces bird diversity and could increase costs from bird damage by up to 76%. That's in the absence of doing something to protect the strawberries from the bird damage. More damage and fecal contamination was found near fences and places where birds can perch. So in a small farm, a really simple mitigation strategy might be something like this bird repellent on posts and places where birds might be apt to perch. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk about sunflower damage because and this is a study led by Sarah Cross and colleagues also out west. They looked at bird damage to sunflowers, and this is really important research since birds are notorious for causing a great deal of damage in seed and grain crops. And what they found was the bird damage was highest along field edges. Insect damage is greater than bird damage overall. Insect damage was 4 times greater in fields with bare or weedy edges, and possibly this could be because there are more insect-eating birds in the fields with woody edges. So similar to the research, the 2 subsequent research studies, that environment surrounding the growing areas is perhaps shifting the population of birds. All right. So just to look a little bit more at the pathogens in produce, this is a study by Olivia Smith, also done out west. And they looked at pathogen. They actually sampled over 2,000 birds, and they sampled 1,215 feces samples in brassica fields. So there's a really extensive sampling study. On 50 farms in California. And what they found is that birds are reservoirs of human pathogens, especially Campylobacter, so several times more prevalence of Campylobacter. And non-native birds were 4 times more likely to carry Campylobacter than our native species. So think native species like bluebirds compared to invasive or non-native species like starlings. Okay? And the amount of natural habitat in the landscape was not associated with the amount of feces on plants. So you might have shifts in those bird populations, but the overall number of feces remains the same, right? And the proximity of livestock was associated with increased feces on plants and increased Campylobacter. So from some of the other studies that we've presented today, that's consistent with that. The proximity of livestock really seems to be a consistent risk factor there. All right, really good news. Although this research from Olivia Smith was conducted out in California, she's now a postdoc at the University of Georgia, and I think we can expect some more work from the Southeast from her. All right, just to kind of close out the research, this is a really interesting study from Nora Navarro-Gonzalez and Michelle Dave Russell and at UC Western Center for Food Safety. So they're also out in California. They use falconry to deter the nuisance birds from a leafy green field. So they release the falcon scares away the birds, and they study the effects of that. They found that it was effective at reducing bird counts in leafy green fields, of course, and that bird presence actually remained low for about 3 days. So that's a good example of actually using a bird to our advantage. And it makes me wonder what might happen if we were able to encourage the natural presence of raptors in those growing environments. All right, so does the research out west that I've highlighted translate to the Southeast? I don't know. Our climate is quite a bit different. Our water sources are different. Our concentrated animal feeding operations, we don't have feedlots so much. We have poultry operations, and we have a lot of smaller animal operations. We have different wild birds and different insects. We have different migratory patterns for our wild birds, and we have a different scale of agriculture. So I'm going to say that our more research is definitely needed, and in particular in our climate in our area. Right. So I will sum things up by saying that training is key, since I'm an extension educator. If you haven't attended a Produce Safety Alliance training, I would highly recommend that. You should be able to walk away from that training, being able to prioritize the risks on your farm. And you might find that wildlife is not the thing that you need to address the most, right? Focus on reducing risk, not eliminating it, especially when you start thinking about the one raptor or the one bluebird flying overhead. They're probably not the greatest source of risk. More research is needed, especially in our area, and I would suggest making an adaptive strategy by changing one thing at a time, because we don't know what effects some of these strategies can have in different environments and different places. So one thing that I'm going to close with was when I was researching for this presentation, I found out that University of Georgia's Nikki Surratt will lead a study with Bill Snyder and Laurel Dunn, also at University of Georgia. They're going to use modeling techniques to determine if there are links between how close livestock are to farm and pathogens found in bird feces. So that'll be a really interesting study done right here in our area that will lend some critical information to being able to implement some smart strategies. All right, I think I might have time for a couple questions. So thank you guys, and I'll turn it back over to Jill.
Okay, so thank you so much, Kristen. That was a wonderful presentation. Please, as a reminder, you can put your questions down in the chat bar in the Q&A down in the left-hand side. Also, another reminder, don't forget to sign out with your first and last name in the states where you need the CEUs. So let's see if we have any questions come in. Okay, I don't see anything quite yet, and I believe I'm looking in the right place this time.
I'm looking too. I don't see anything.
Okay. I do want to let you all know that the next presentation is going to start at normal time. But we'll stay to see if there's a couple questions that come in. Okay, well, I don't see anything coming in. I'd like to thank Kristen for that great presentation, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Right. And with that ends our presentation.